Welcome to the City Club for the 2016 High School Debate Championship. My name is Tom Lucchese, and I am a partner at the law firm of Baker and Hostetler here in Cleveland. And I am pleased, proud, and privileged on behalf of my firm and myself to sponsor this debate in honor of our late partner, Patrick Jordan. Before I get started, I want to welcome, as I always do, Pat's lovely wife, Sharon Sobel Jordan, who many of you have probably seen on the news. She's the chief of staff for the county executive. Very successful and beautiful woman. One of my favorite people in the whole world. And Pat was one of my favorite people too. And I'm very, very pleased that my firm has been able to sponsor this event in honor of Pat since he died in 1995. So most of you weren't born then, and you obviously didn't know Pat, but this is a way of keeping Pat's memory alive. And as you guys get older, you'll realize it's important to remember people that have influenced our lives. And Pat was a very dynamic character. I want to just spend a minute or two talking about Pat and why we do this. You had to know Pat. He was a big Irish guy. He was balding. My wife thought he was cute. I wasn't sure I thought he was so cute. Sharon thought he was kind of cute. He had a gap-toothed smile, and he's what you'd call, he wasn't fat, but he was big. He was large-boned. And Pat he was a high school debater of championship caliber, and he loved to debate. But more than that, he loved to argue. And we would argue about everything. He was a very successful lawyer, very well-known. He was a prosecutor in Manhattan. On the serious crimes. He did a lot of serious crimes prosecution. And the rumor is he never lost a case. I believe that, knowing Pat. But he would stand before you and he would argue. And I got to tell you, high school kids, we didn't have the internet back then. We didn't have Google. We couldn't fact check in the middle of an argument. So arguments weren't necessarily won on the merits. They were won by sheer force of personality. And Pat, with his big frame and his balding head and his gap-toothed smile, he was left-handed, and he would make his arguments, and he would wave that left hand in front of you, totally dismissive of anything you had to say. And it was so effective, you began to doubt that you were even right. So I don't know if we'll see any of these tactics up here tonight. But let me tell you one short story, and if you guys have been watching the clips of previous ones on YouTube, maybe you've seen this story already. But I want to tell you something that exemplifies Pat's character and the best qualities about him. My firm was involved in the development of what is now Key Tower, where our offices are now. We just moved there in January. And before Key Tower was built, there were other buildings and businesses on that land. And the developers who we represented took that land with help from the city through the power of eminent domain. Okay, so the state or the government can come in and take land for a public purpose, and that was deemed to be such. And Pat's job was to negotiate with the landowners and the people that own businesses to buy out their interests. And it was a tough job because people didn't want to sell or didn't think they were getting a fair price. And our job on behalf of the developers was to keep the price low, and people, of course, wanted to get more money for their business or their land. And Pat got into a very hot debate, and negotiation's a form of debate, right? So he got into a very contested debate with a restaurant owner named Joe. And Joe had a restaurant in the engineers building. And they went tooth and nail back and forth for weeks, for months actually, over the value of this leasehold interest that Joe and his restaurant had in the engineers building. And at the end of an incredibly painful and hotly debated and contested debate, they came to an agreement. And Pat was happy with the agreement. Our client was happy with the agreement. The city was happy. Everybody was happy. We'd kind of won, or so we thought. But the most important thing to Pat was not that he won. It was the fact that he and Joe, after it was over, shook hands, they embraced, and they became lifelong friends. And Joe opened up another restaurant in downtown, and we used to go there for lunch 3 or 4 times a week. And he would embrace all of us at Baker. He knew everybody by first name. He loved Pat. He embraced Pat. Literally, they'd hug each other when we came in to eat. He just thought Pat was the most gentlemanly and above board negotiator he'd ever dealt with, and he was perfectly happy and content with the outcome. And that sums up kind of Pat's view. I mean, he played hard, he negotiated diligently, they went at it tooth and nail, they were both above board in their dealings with each other, and at the end of the day, they concluded their negotiations with honor and respect for each other, which is, I'm sure, what we're going to see up here, which is not what we've seen in the Republican national debates recently. But I just wanted to share that because I want to keep the memory of Pat alive. It's important to me personally, it's important to my firm because of the role Pat played in helping to grow and develop our Cleveland office. So with that, I want to turn this over to Nicole Kostelik from Hawkins School, who's going to introduce our debaters. She's going to tell you what the topic for today's debate is, and then for many of us that are not familiar with it, she's going to go over the rules, so we'll have some idea of what's going on today. Okay, Nicole?
Thank you. On behalf of all of the debaters, coaches, and judges here today, as well as the Cleveland debate community at large, I would like to offer our sincerest thanks to the City Club for its continual support of high school speech and debate. For over 30 years, the City Club has been generous enough to host the season finals in Lincoln Douglas debate. I also know that I speak for everyone here when I express our immense gratitude towards Baker-Hostetler, which has sponsored this championship for nearly 20 years in memory of partner Patrick J. Jordan, a highly respected trial lawyer at the firm who passed in 1995. Thank you so much to everyone at Baker-Hostetler for giving debate this moment in the spotlight. It's an activity that transforms high school students, whether it's through newfound competence in public speaking or through the amazing community the Cleveland District has to offer. Today's debate has a panel of 3 judges. Ann Farah, who recently received the North Coast District Volunteer of the Year Award, Devin Snook, coach of speech and debate at Vermillion High School, and Samantha Mouche of Gabriel Partners. The 2 debaters sitting before you on stage are both incredibly talented and have also worked hard to get here. Omer Ashruf, a university school junior, coached by Mr. Peter Paik and Mr. James Lewis, and Gigi Protasiewicz, a junior from Hathaway Brown, coached by Jason Habig. Both of these debaters have qualified to the national tournament, which will occur in June. The debate that will take place is a Lincoln Douglas debate, which means that competitors must evaluate current political and social issues through a values-based lens. Resolutions in LD look beyond the simple benefits or effectiveness of policies and mandates, but at their fundamental levels of justice and morality. Each debater will present a value, which they will claim to be the ultimate good to be achieved in the round, a value criterion, a way of clearly measuring their value, and contentions, which will show why their side of the resolution that they defend best upholds the value criterion. Each debater will have a chance to cross-examine after their case is initially presented, and they will also have opportunities to rebut their opponent's points. Both sides have an equal amount of speaking time, an equal amount of cross-examining time, and preparation time, but the affirmative has the advantage of speaking first and last, while the negative has the advantage of longer speech times throughout the debate. The resolution the debaters will be debating today is resolved: the United States ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. Congratulations to both debaters on being here today. It's been an honor to be your fellow competitor over the past few years, and if everyone is ready, let the debate begin.
So I'd like to begin by thanking the City Club of Cleveland and the law firm of Baker and Hostetler on behalf of the entire community for their continuous support of high school Lincoln Douglas debate and allowing us to show the Cleveland area, the entire city of Cleveland, the activities that so many teenagers, that so many students love and dedicate their weekends to. Second, I'd like to thank my family and friends for their unending support over the course of the past 3 years. To my family who has accepted my debate frenzy, thank you for pushing me towards the activity in the first place, and thank you for always having my back. Third, I want to thank the U.S. team and the alumni for their encouragement and their help in furthering my understanding of Lincoln Douglas debate, specifically Victor, Sam, Gabe, Reese, Aiden, Armin, Chandler, John, Will, Andrew, Karchin, and Isaiah. And this really goes without saying, but I'd like to thank my coaches, Mr. James Lewis and Mr. Peter Paik, for helping me transition into Lincoln Douglas debate, and for spending countless hours helping me and our entire team and for their words of wisdom, and for helping us prepare the best arguments. And I'm really, really grateful for their entire commitment to the team. Now, finally, I'd like to extend my thanks to the entire debate community, both competitors and judges. A former debater once said to me that debate is like a part-time job, and I couldn't agree more with that statement. Every coach, every parent, every competitor, every judge has invested so much time in this activity, and I want to thank all of them for providing me with such a great experience and for being so energetic and so encouraging and dedicating so much activity that we all love and dedicate our time towards. So, with that being said, let's go on to the constructive. If all my judges are ready. Gigi. Let's begin. The world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. Because I agree with Woodrow Wilson, I affirm resolved, the United States ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. Democracy is a system of government by the whole population or all eligible members of the state, and is one with representative institutions and a rule of law. The highest value in today's debate is that of justice, defined as giving each his due. We must strive to give all people what they are due, what they deserve. In order to do this, the United States government has an obligation to strive to protect the liberty of all people. Liberty is an inalienable right of each and every individual, which exists independently of any type of citizenship or any state, and stems from our intrinsic worth as human beings. Thus, the value criterion for today's debate will be protecting liberty. In other words, the way in which we measure whether democracy promotion is just or not is by looking to see which side in this debate best provides for the protection of liberty. My first major line of argument is that democracy promotion protects the liberty of both the citizens of the US and of the Middle East. The first subpoint is that democracy promotion reduces terrorism. According to Sam Choi of the University of Illinois, he explains that democratic institutions provide a formidable bulwark against terrorism for two reasons. First, when authoritarian leaders use threats of punishment and violence through corrupt authorities, citizens are incentivized to challenge the legitimacy of authoritarian rule. This often occurs through the use of terrorist violence either by themselves and or with the help of international terrorist groups. Second, democratic institutions discourage ordinary citizens from resorting to politically motivated violence over peaceful resolution in conflict. In short, democratic rule of law systems offer ordinary citizens nonviolent ways or nonviolent means of settling grievances, so they are far less likely to resort to terrorist violence as a last resort. It's clear that not only do autocracies in the Middle East help to create and in fact endorse terrorism, but promoting democracy would solve this problem. Additionally, Azim Ibrahim of the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding writes that improving our image, especially to the Middle East and especially to the Muslim world, would cripple terrorist recruitment operations and would deter citizens from joining terrorist organizations. He goes on to write that we improve our image by stopping our support for oppressive regimes and promoting democracy. Obviously, terrorism is a danger to both Americans and citizens of the Middle East, and implementing democracy would free both parties of these egregious liberty violations inflicted by terrorism. The second subpoint is that democratic institutions are vital to protect liberty. The very foundation of democracy and promotion requires individual liberty, and including the freedom of expression, the freedom to participate, the freedom to own private property, and so on and so forth. In fact, Sean Lynn Jones of the Center for Science and International Affairs concurs, writing that a democratic political process based on the electoral competition depends on the freedom of expression of political views and the freedom to make electoral choices. Moreover, governments that are accountable for their own citizens and for the public are far less likely to deprive their citizens of human rights. Even imperfect and illiberal democracies tend to offer more liberty than autocracies, and liberal democracies are very likely to promote liberty, end quote. When we examine the examples of Tunisia or Turkey, two nations in the Middle East that are developed democracies, we see that democracy is compatible with the Middle East. In Egypt and in Jordan, two nations that have specifically received democracy promotion aid from the US and are developing democracies, we see that the US's effort to promote democracy is also successful. In short, the promotion of democracy and the democratic institutions give the individual the liberty to influence his or her own government. All men and women, by virtue of their common humanity, have a right to freedom. My second major line of argument is that democracy promotion allows the US to exercise its own liberty to disapprove of the atrocities in the Middle East. Over the past decade, we've seen the formation and dominance of radical terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS, ruthless dictators who are actively trying to kill their own citizens, and the genocide of minority groups. In fact, Americans witness human rights violations in the Middle East on a daily basis. The first subpoint is that the US has an obligation to reject such atrocities. The US is justified in intervening if and when a certain government or nation has violated the liberty of its own people. In addition, by not acting in the face of these atrocities, the US tacitly approves of these egregious rights violations. Affirming allows us to avoid the moral culpability of standing by and doing nothing. The second subpoint is that promoting democracy represents a rejection of the current atrocities. Intervening in the region reflects the US's firm belief that the aforementioned actions are immoral. Promoting democracy is a key way for us to send the moral message that the violations of human rights, that genocide, that terrorism are morally repugnant and impermissible in the international community. It sends the message to the international society distinguishing right from wrong and resulting in a more just society both domestically and abroad. Democracy is a long-term solution that prevents these atrocities. Thus, this form of intervention exemplifies a rejection of the atrocities, allows the US to demonstrate its liberty by sending a moral message to the world, and prevents tacit approval against these crimes against humanity, all of which protect our liberty. For the aforementioned reasons, because promoting democracy is both the right thing to do and in our best interest, we have no reason not to affirm. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us at the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Nick Castell here with Sebastian Williams, a sophomore at Gilmore Academy. He is also involved in debate there, and we will be talking with you throughout the hour about what we're seeing and about how debate works as we're waiting for our competitors here to prepare their next arguments. Sebastian, I wonder if you could just explain quickly here, how long have you been debating for?
So this has actually been my second year debating, but I did what's called congressional debate my 8th grade year. So what that basically is just more so focusing on the specific implementations of the kind of general principles we're talking about here in Lincoln Douglas debate. So I've seen both sides of the debate. I've talked about the moral sides, kind of discussing the very principles that go into legislation, but I've also actually talked about the legislation itself.
And it looks like we are about to return to the debate in just a moment.
If you're ready.
So throughout your case, you talk a lot about how democracy has positive effects such as reducing terrorism, correct?
Sure, that's the first subpoint under my first contention.
So is democracy promotion in the Middle East necessarily going to mean that these countries are becoming democracies?
Okay, so once again, let's look back to my definition of democracy. So once again, it's a system of government by the whole population are all eligible members of the state. It's one with representative institutions and one of a rule of law. So again, when a country in the Middle East becomes a democracy, it exhibits these traits.
Okay, but if you don't mind answering my question, does democracy promotion mean that these countries are going to change into a democratic form of government?
Well, yes, that's the goal.
So when the United States promotes democracy, say in Egypt, the United States is going to come in and Egypt will just transform into a democracy?
I mean, yes, that's the affirmative stance.
Could you just reiterate what are some examples of successful democracy promotion that you
I'd
talk
love
about?
to. Yeah, so once again, in my constructive, I look at Tunisia and Turkey. Not only that, but I actually advocate
Okay,
for the
so-
example. Can I finish? Do you mind?
Yeah, sure.
Also, Egypt and Jordan. Both of those countries have specifically received U.S. democracy promotion aid and are now developing democracies with successful parliaments. Not only that, you can look to examples such as Israel as well.
Okay, so what has the United States done that promoted democracy in Turkey?
Oh, no. Turkey and Tunisia are two examples of developed democracies that became democracies on their own.
Okay, so those aren't applicable to the resolution then, correct?
No. What I'm saying is that those are two prime examples about how democracy is compatible with the Middle East.
Okay, and you talk about Jordan. Jordan is a monarchy, correct?
Yes, but it also does have representative institutions and a functioning parliament that involves the political participation of the individuals.
But just to clarify, Jordan is not a democracy then?
Well, okay, once again, I'm saying that it's a developing democracy in the sense that it has representative institutions, it does have a rule of law, and it does have a functioning parliament.
So you would say that Jordan is becoming more like a democracy then?
Sure.
Okay, so would you say that it's important to consider the effects that democracy promotion policies will have in the Middle East?
Okay, so first and foremost, we should be looking to the moral obligation of the United States. And yes, after that, we can look to, I guess, the pragmatic sense of it.
So then, would you say that it's morally right or just for the United States to try and implement policies that will have significant negative effects?
Well, once again, I've kind of disproven that. Once again, look to my first contention. I say not only do we reduce terrorism threefold, but also democratic institutions provide not only a formidable bulwark against terrorism, but also liberty for each and every individual.
Just quickly, I didn't hear the threefold statistic about terrorism in your case.
No, not threefold. There's three separate reasons.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
You're listening to the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. That was Gigi Protasiewicz of Hathaway Brown School and Omer Ashruf of the University School debating. I'm Nick Castell with IdeaStream. I'm here with Sebastian Williams, a sophomore at Gilmore Academy. So what we just saw there looked like cross-examination.
Yeah.
What were they doing?
So the first cross-examination is usually done by the negative going on the affirmative. Basically, just asking them questions not only about clarification on their case, but also about trying to hammer in the points she might see kind of problematic with this case.
So you're trying to find weaknesses in their argument.
Yeah,
That's the
and also
idea.
get some clarification going on too. For example, she was talking about whether or not she actually saw democracy promotion being effective in the past. That was kind of the point she's trying to get through in cross-examination and trying to see whether or not he has a sufficient answer to that so she can better construct her constructive.
So we've got some judges who are watching all of this, and when you are debating, what are you trying to do here? Are you trying to convince the judges to agree with you or something else?
So the debate is kind of about persuasion, but also about kind of winning the arguments. So when you look at a judge, they're taking notes at the same time, right? They're trying to make sure you made the arguments and then the opponent's responding to them, and then you respond to the arguments they made back to you. But at the same time, you also want to be persuasive, meaning you want to try and get the technical arguments out and you want to try and win those, but you also want to present it in a very clear fashion in which your average man on the street or woman on the street could be able to understand it effectively.
Mm-hmm. And are you, when you're making these arguments then, I mean, are you hoping that the judge will listen to what you're saying and say, yes, I agree with you, or are they trying to say, even if I disagree with you, I think you argued the best, and therefore I'll give you the win?
Yeah, so debate in and of itself is kind of like a game. You have your arguments, and you have the arguments that they make against your arguments. And it's all about which debater can best pull through the arguments they make in their constructive and trying to bring it into the end and show how it functions in the round and as a reason as to why affirming would ultimately lead to the best upholding of your mutually shared value.
And we'll get a taste of that in just a moment here as we return to the debate.
Just before beginning, I'd like to thank a few people. My coach, Mr. Habig, all of my teammates on the debate team, and the City Club and Baker Hostetler for making this event possible. I negate the resolution. Resolved, the United States ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. For the sake of clarity, I will provide the following observation. It is the affirmative's burden to continue to demonstrate tangible benefits of democracy promotion, as in no world is it just for the United States to implement foreign policies that have only negative impacts on the millions of people living in the Middle East. The value for this round is justice, defined as giving each their due. The United States government must endeavor to pursue policies that result in just outcomes, both for its citizens and in the world as a whole. The value criterion is encouraging global stability for two reasons. First, in order for dues to be able to be given and received, a stable environment must exist. Without such a setting of stability, it is extremely difficult to achieve justice, and it is very difficult for countries to pursue their own just policies. Second, a stable environment throughout the world helps to ensure justice for citizens of both the United States and of other countries. With that in mind, I will offer the following two contentions to support my argument. Contention 1. Democracy promotion increases terrorism. After the U.S. entered Iraq in 2003 to topple the dictator Saddam Hussein, terrorist attacks in the country increased greatly. Moreover, terrorists in Iraq were able to innovate and develop new methods that spread to regions where they had not previously been in use. Clearly, not every form of democracy promotion would take the form of an invasion, but this example serves to illustrate how a negatively perceived foreign presence in a country can spark backlash and conflict. According to Pew polling, many countries in the Middle East have a clear negative view of the United States. Thus, United States attempts to involve themselves in these countries' politics causes anger and anti-US sentiment. Illustrating this point, Robert Pape of the University of Chicago finds that the motivation of groups that carry out terrorist attacks is almost always to fight against foreign presence in the region. Furthermore, James Piazza of the University of North Carolina, after examining 30 years of data on the effects of democracy promotion in 19 Middle Eastern countries, found that democracy promotion actually increased terrorism. Therefore, we can see that the United States' promotion of democracy in the Middle East only exacerbates the problem of terrorism. Contention 2. Democracy promotion is not effective. One key factor leading to the ineffectiveness of democracy promotion is backlash from foreign governments. Richard Lugar of the National Endowment for Democracy writes that governments receiving forms of democracy assistance are increasingly unwilling to accept it, and often take measures to restrict and reduce the effects of democracy promotion. Some of these measures may include cracking down on political opponents and pro-democracy organizations. Thomas Carothers of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace explains that authoritarian political regimes have denounced democracy promotion as interference and retaliated against NGOs. In fact, in 2013, over 90 countries worldwide had prohibited foreign funding for local NGOs. Moreover, even in the rare cases where democratization occurs to the point where elections are held, it in no way means that governments beneficial for liberty and human rights will be elected. Look to the following two examples. First, in Palestine, when elections were held, the people elected Hamas, a terrorist group that continues to carry out attacks in the region. Second, in Egypt, the people elected Mohammed Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, a political party that sought to consolidate power and establish theocratic rule. Clearly, even when elections take place, it does not guarantee favorable outcomes for U.S. interests or minorities in the Middle East. Walter Mead of Bard College summarizes, explaining that despite the countless amounts of time and money that the United States and European countries have spent trying to encourage the growth of democracy, their policies have not been effective. Thus, democracy promotion is not effective at causing actual, beneficial change and has the potential to actually destabilize countries. For these reasons, I negate the resolution. Now, moving on to my opponent's case, we both present the value of justice, so that's the lens that we're going to be looking at to evaluate today's round. Now, my opponent presents the value criterion of basically liberty, and I have one main problem with this value criterion, which is that people cannot exercise any liberty or have any liberty at all when the situation is unstable. For example, if it's the middle of a civil war, you are not going to have any way to choose what you want to do in your own life. You simply have to flee the situation or die. That is no liberty whatsoever, and that's the reason why we need to have stability before we have liberty. So for that reason, we have to prioritize my value criterion of encouraging global stability. So in my opponent's first contention, subpoint A, he talks about how democracy leads to a decrease in terrorism. Now, you can apply a lot of the stuff that I talk about in my own first contention, but additionally, it's important to note that his contention is contingent on democracy promotion actually leading to countries becoming democracies, which, as I show in my second contention, is certainly not the case. Secondly, even if you look at this logically, even in situations where countries do become democracies, if terrorists do not achieve their goals through democratic avenues, that doesn't mean that they're simply going to give up and be persuaded to follow other measures. So even just logically, you can see there that democracies aren't going to reduce terrorism. So, another key issue with this is just look to my studies on this point. Remember, James Piazza looked at over 30 years of data and found that this point just simply doesn't stand up. Democracy promotion doesn't reduce terrorism. So in his subpoint B, my opponent talks about how a lot of democratic institutions protect people's rights and liberties. Again, this all depends on democracy promotion actually causing democracy, which is going to be a key point in today's debate. Additionally, he brings up a lot of examples such as Jordan, which, as I mentioned in cross-examination, is not even a democracy, it is a monarchy. So clearly that is not very relevant to today's discussion. So in my opponent's second contention, he talks about how democracy promotion allows the U.S. to disapprove of atrocities with the subpoints of basically the United States has an obligation to do something, and democracy promotion means the rejection of atrocities. So the main issue that I take with this contention is that above all else, it's not going to be justified for the United States to intervene in situations in cases where it is obvious from past examples and current evidence that intervening will only exacerbate the situation and cause more harms than benefits. It's simply not just, which is the value that we're looking at in today's round, for the United States to pursue foreign policies that are only going to harm the lives of the people living in the Middle East. And clearly you can see that democracy promotion harms countries by increasing terrorism and increasing instability. So for these reasons, I negate the resolution. Thank you.
That was Gigi Protasiewicz of Hathaway Brown School delivering the negative to the following resolution. The U.S. ought to promote democracy in the Middle East, and now we will continue with the debate.
Okay, Gigi.
Yes.
My judges are ready? Fantastic. Let's begin. So let's start off with your criterion of global stability. How do we ensure global stability?
Well, I would say that we don't need to 100% ensure global stability, but
Right.
the United States should take policies that would attempt to preserve stability and make sure that we're not causing more instability.
What does it mean to be stable? What does
For
that mean?
example, if a country is actively at war or involved in a civil war, then it is not stable.
Okay, so countries in the Middle East are stable. Yes or no?
Could you clarify?
It's pretty self-explanatory. Countries in the Middle East right now are stable.
I would not say so. For example, Syria is not very stable.
So what do we do when we see that they're not stable?
Well, I'm not a policymaker, but in the context of this resolution, we shouldn't promote democracy because it would exacerbate the instability that's already there.
So we should let them be on their own. We shouldn't do anything.
I'm not saying that the government shouldn't do anything. I'm saying that they should not do democracy promotion because that would harm the situation.
So then what should they do in the face of these atrocities?
Well, it's not necessarily my responsibility to promote any sort
Well,
of
yeah.
plan that the United States needs to follow.
Okay.
But when we're looking at the benefits and harms of what democracy promotion does, then clearly there are
Okay.
basically negative consequences.
Great. So you don't really touch upon the moral aspect of today's resolution. Why does the U.S. have a moral obligation to not promote democracy?
Well, I would say that it's a pretty big moral obligation not to put the lives of millions of people in the Middle East at risk, and that's exactly
Okay,
what would happen.
so let's
in a
talk about your
third world.
examples really quickly. In Iraq, what was our approach to this, to promoting democracy?
The United States intervened militarily.
Okay, so can't we just not do that next time?
Well, there are multiple different ways to promote democracy.
Right.
However, all of these policies, as I talk about, are basically going to be seen as foreign intervention, and that's going to cause backlash and an increase in terrorism.
So every single form of democracy promotion is going to cause backlash.
Well, all the forms that are the United States intervening in the politics and affairs of a country in the Middle East.
Okay, so just like to reiterate, every single form of intervention will cause backlash.
Democracy promotion specifically, yes.
Okay, so what about the successes in the Middle East? Like when we look to Egypt, or something as simple as Jordan, which does have democratic institutions.
I'm glad you brought up Egypt. I actually talk about that in my own case.
Okay.
And what happened in Egypt is currently the democratically elected government isn't even in place anymore because there was a coup that overthrew it.
Right, but now they have a parliament, right?
Well, the fact that there was a coup and overthrew it basically means that there wasn't respect for the rule of law, which you talk about as key to democracy.
Okay, but what's their current state? What's their political atmosphere right now?
Well, as I said, it's ruled by basically military leadership, the coup that overthrew it.
Okay, we'll move on. So you bring up this example of Hamas gaining power in Palestine, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so are they still in power?
I can't speak to as of this very moment,
Oh.
but I can tell you that they
That's
are still
unfortunate.
committing
Do you know?
atrocities.
Do you know what happened? Do you know what happened after they gained power in Palestine?
I believe that's time.
Okay.
You're tuned to the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland, and you've just heard Omer Ashruf of University School and Gigi Protasiewicz of Hathaway Brown. I'm Nick Castell from IdeaStream here with Sebastian Williams, a sophomore at Gilmore Academy. Now, the resolution that's being debated right now is the U.S. ought to promote democracy in the Middle East.
Correct.
It's a pretty heavy topic. Are all the topics that you deal with in high school debate so big and serious?
Well, usually all the topics we discuss are like relevant moral questions that somehow affect us. For example, one very recent one was whether or not the United States should allow people or allow adolescents to make autonomous medical choices. So each one has this kind of like overviewish theme that kind of talks about like whether or not the government or whether or not an individual has such a moral obligation to do something.
So you're not just dealing with, an issue in the news, but you're dealing with the bigger questions that it raises too, morally, ethically, politically.
Yeah, so a lot of times when we look at the news, we see stories of, for example, the Syrian government right now not being in a very good spot due to the fact that we've had previous intervention in that region. And so while the newspaper itself just kind of talks about the end consequences, what Lincoln Douglas debate does is kind of looks at the reason as to why, whether or not the action we took in the first place was morally obligatory or morally permissible, or whether or not we should have taken it in the first place.
So what do you do to prepare for a debate like this?
So doing debate in general requires you have good writing skills, good analytical skills, and also good research skills. Because you can be a really good individual who's really good at analyzing a situation and might have read a lot of philosophy, for example, but that's not really good unless you have some evidence to actually back up your points. So being good at Lincoln Douglas debate requires that you both look at the philosophical and abstract point of view, but at the same time also kind of look at what's actually happening and look at real-world examples.
So what exactly are you reading to make sure that you're staying up on the news and have an understanding of all the issues?
So you can read anything from journal articles, so your CNN articles you find on the CNN homepage. It's just any form of like research you can find on the internet, or even in books for that matter. It's just general researching the subject to gain a good familiarity with it, and also seeing how it would apply once we actually did it.
So you're reading the newspaper? Are you reading books as well?
Yeah, so especially when it comes to what kind of topic you're talking about. For example, if you're talking about more of a philosophical topic, for example, the autonomous medical choices one I mentioned, that's going to be a little bit more into the books and kind of looking at what it means to be autonomous. But other topics, for example, whether or not we should intervene in the Middle East, requires that you look a little bit more into the news and see like what's happening in the current events. So it kind of varies from topic to topic.
So far in this debate, we've heard the affirmative argument, we've heard the negative argument, we've heard the two positions cross-examine one another.
Yeah.
What do we expect next? What are the rest of the parts of this debate?
So what's going to happen next is what's called the first affirmative rebuttal, and that's where Omer's going to come up here and kind of try and rebut the main points that Gigi's been making throughout the round. So in that speech, he's going to basically try and answer the argument she's making about terrorism and about past failed attempts, while at the same time also defending his points about saying how it actually fixes terrorism and how we have a moral obligation to do so.
And so the judges are listening to all of this. Are there particular things they're looking for, you think, in this stage of the debate?
Yeah, so the judges at this point in this stage of the debate are going to be kind of looking at the round on the totality, right? They want to basically catch what you're saying, and then at the end of the debate, they want to be able to tie everything together to see whether or not you fulfilled your burden of demonstrating whether or not the resolution is true or false.
And so they're listening to all this now. They've got to weigh these decisions, and it looks like we're about to return to the next segment of the debate right now.
Sounds good.
Okay. So, just as a brief roadmap for the judges, I plan to attack the negative and then go back and defend the affirmative stance. Okay, so if the judges are ready. Gigi? Let's begin. So starting off with the value of justice, I agree with this. We're looking to the dues of each and every individual. So moving on to our criterion of global stability. Now, I have a couple problems with this. First of all, it's very vague in the sense that she doesn't tell us, one, how to achieve it, or two, what it entails. Once again, like she conceded in cross-examination, there are certain countries in the Middle East that are not stable at this moment. Thus, we have to be proactive and take stances to promote democracy to make sure that they are stable in the long term. Going into our first contention about terrorism, once again, I have a few problems with this argument. So first of all, she kind of sidesteps my three arguments that I make. First of all, that autocracies cause the problem and endorse terrorism. Second, that democracies in fact solve it. And third, that we're improving our image to the Middle East. But also, she brings up this example of Iraq. Once again, there's a couple problems here. First, when America intervened, it had no set plan. A lot of mistakes were made, not because of the problems of democracy, but because of implementation itself. So the answer is very simple. We go into the Middle East and we have a set plan and we don't intervene arbitrarily or militarily. Once again, the only example she brings up is Iraq. I've already addressed this, that this was tied to U.S. military intervention. There's so many other ways to promote democracy. We shouldn't just be tied to U.S. military intervention. And the idea or the country of Iraq really is irrelevant as her argument because there's so many different ways to promote democracy. Going on to our second contention about how it's not effective. First of all, once again, this contention doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Remember that there's so many ways to promote democracy. It's not fair to say that every single form of promoting democracy is going to be ineffective. Furthermore, according to the NPR and the Pew Research Center, a lot of citizens of the Middle East are proponents for democracy and actually are advocates for democracy. What agitates them the most is when foreign powers look at them and don't do anything and passively stand by, which is what we'll be doing if you negate today's resolution. Second, she brings up this idea, or the argument of Palestine and Hamas. But what she didn't answer in cross-examination is when the US and the UN Security Council took corrective measures and intervened, this was no longer a problem. Thus, once the US intervenes and takes corrective stances, this isn't an issue because now Hamas is not ruling Palestine anymore. So with that being said, let's go into my side of the arguments. So against my criterion, she only has one response, that liberty can't be reached without stability. First and foremost, we don't know what stability entails. Furthermore, she doesn't tell us how to achieve it. My advocacy is that we promote democracy to make sure that we do achieve stability. Furthermore, she doesn't refute the argument that we still have an obligation to protect liberty of each and every individual, that it is a fundamental due of each and every individual. Going on to my first contention, she says that this is just based on implementation. Once again, my third justification tells you that regardless of success, we improve our image to the Middle East and to the Muslim world. Furthermore, look to the argument that we shouldn't be looking just to implementation here, because the US can change its implementation over time. Once again, she proposes the arguments of Hamas and Egypt, and I've already refuted these, that we took corrective stances the very next year, and this wasn't a problem anymore because Hamas is no longer ruling Palestine. Against my second subpoint, she says that once again, this is based on the fact that we actually need democracy. Once again, I've already refuted the argument about past failures. We can implement democracy in so many different forms, in so many different ways, that it's not fair to say that every single type of promoting democracy is going to be a failure. Against my second contention, she said it's not justified because of the past. Once again, the argument isn't refuted, that if we don't do anything, that we're tacitly consenting to the atrocities, that we are going to be held morally culpable of the situation, that we're not protecting liberty. I've refuted on and on that this idea of past examples can be changed, that we can go back and take a different stance, that we can have an effective plan. So for these reasons, we still have no reason not to affirm.
That was Omer Ashruf delivering an argument at the High School Debate Championship of the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Nick Costello with IdeaStream, here with Sebastian Williams, a sophomore at Gilmore Academy. So we heard it said earlier on in the program that debate is like a part-time job.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
I definitely would, and for a few reasons. I think primarily debate kind of requires that you have a level of dedication that some other events or sports in high school don't necessarily require. Debate, for example, requires that you get up early on Saturday mornings and then compete for the next 10 hours or so and just basically talk about modern politics, which for a lot of high schoolers might not seem like the best thing to do. But also it requires you have a lot of analytical skills that not only just applied on the day you're actually doing the debate, but also in the months going up to it requires you to have a lot of research and a good understanding of the topic.
So give me a sense here of how long do you think you're spending outside of class preparing for debate or going to tournaments, getting ready to make arguments?
Well, it really depends on how well you want to do. I think one of the greatest things about debate is that how much effort you put in really does correlate to how well you actually do in the long run. Debaters who do tons of research and are really familiar with the topic are going to be able to answer questions that they're given in cross-examination and are going to have a really good ability to address their opponent's case with the simple facts of the matter.
So you go to school, I mean, you're in class all day, you come home from class, you've got homework to do, you've got things to read, maybe papers to write, and there's debate to prepare for. How do you make all that work?
Well, I think it's just kind of the same logic as you would with any sport or any other activity. You just have to make time. I think a great thing about debate, though, is that a lot of the stuff you can do in the debate world also kind of applies to stuff you might be doing in school. For example, if you have a paper on Middle Eastern relations, doing work on that paper is also going to be really helpful for the debate topic as well.
And you said that you've got to get up early on Saturdays and go out to tournaments. Are you traveling around the state, around the country, or the region? What kind of distance are you traveling here?
So it really depends on what level you want to compete on. For example, there's tournaments in California, but there's also tournaments in Canton. So it really depends on where you want to go, because there's debate for everybody, regardless of what part of the country you're in.
And we will return to the debate just now.
So I'm just going to be starting off talking about the affirmative arguments, then moving on to the negative arguments, and then I will simplify today's debate into 3 main points. So my opponent and I both have the value of justice. We agree that that's what we need to be looking to when evaluating today's round, but we have differing value criterions. My opponent supports the value criterion of protecting liberty, whereas I would argue for encouraging global stability. My opponent claims that I don't refute the fact that liberty is a fundamental due. I certainly agree that liberty is something that is important, but what I'm arguing and what I have argued throughout today's debate is that you cannot have any degree of liberty when a situation is unstable. So in order for my opponent to access any sort of benefits that might promote people's liberty, he first has to have a stable situation. And you'll see that promoting democracy destabilizes situations, which makes it completely impossible for people to have any sort of liberty at all. So in my opponent's first contention, subpoint A, remember, I show you basically more examples than just Iraq. My opponent claims that I'm only telling you one example about how terrorism increased in Iraq. Recognize that that is not true. I give you the data that looked at over 30 years of data from 19 different Middle Eastern countries and found that overall, when the United States tries to promote democracy, terrorism increases. And that's going to be a key argument in today's round, because my opponent tries to argue that democracy promotion will also solve stability, will also make the region more stable. But you can see by increasing terrorism, democracy promotion clearly is only serving to destabilize the region. My opponent's subpoint B about democratic institutions, recognize that this is simply just contingent on democracy promotion actually leading to democracy. My opponent says that we don't need to defend specific implementations and look to implementation. However, what you have to see is that if the United States and European countries have been trying to promote democracy in the Middle East, in this region, for tens of years, and for a very long time, and they have tried multiple different strategies in multiple different regions, and if none of these has really been a definitive success story that we can talk about in today's round, then clearly democracy promotion is not going to be effective because of all the logical reasons that I give you. Because foreign governments that are authoritarian, when democracy is promoted by the United States in their countries, they see it as foreign intervention and they crack down and they only become more authoritarian, which harms people's liberty and harms stability. So you can clearly see that I'm even achieving both my opponent and my own value criterion right there. So looking to my opponent's second contention, again, remember what is justified. It's not justified to intervene when intervening would exacerbate the situation. My opponent says that we simply can't do nothing. That's not what I'm arguing for. I don't have to argue for the United States not doing anything in the Middle East. I have to argue that the United States should not promote democracy. And clearly promoting democracy would have more negative benefits than positive ones, and that's why I am negating the resolution. So moving on to my own case, the negative side of the debate, and against my first contention about terrorism, again, my opponent only responds by talking about how Iraq is a bad example, an example of bad implementation. I've already responded to these arguments when I was addressing the affirmatives points. So moving on to my contention 2 about democracy promotion not being effective, my opponent again talks about how there are multiple different ways. My opponent also tells you that many citizens of the Middle East want democracy, but what he doesn't tell you is that many citizens of the Middle East want democracy, but they don't want the United States' version of democracy. They don't want the United States coming into their country and trying to promote democracy and create a form of government that is similar to the United States. That's what they don't want. My opponent also talks about how in Palestine, the United States intervened again and made it so that Hamas was not basically the legitimate government as recognized by the United Nations, which somehow solved the situation and made it all better. It didn't do that. Hamas is still operating as a terrorist organization and still carries out attacks resulting in the deaths of people in the region. Whether or not the United Nations views it as a legitimate government, it is still a major presence in the region and still harming the lives of people who are living in Palestine and Israel. So just moving on to the key voting issues of today's debate, the first main voting issue is that of liberty versus stability. Now remember, stability is a complete prerequisite to having any sort of liberty. If there's a civil war and you're fleeing for your life, as in Syria, as many people are, you don't have any way to have any liberty. You can't choose what you want to do. You can't choose your own outcomes. You have no choices whatsoever. So for that reason, we need to be looking to stability before we can look to liberty. The second key voting issue is that of terrorism. And as I've shown throughout today's debate, because when the United States intervenes with any form of democracy promotion, citizens can view it as foreign intervention and it creates a backlash. And that means that terrorism is only going up in these regions, which is actually backed up by all of the data on research that has been done on the Middle East and on what democracy promotion does in the Middle East. So that's key, because if there's an increase in terrorism, obviously stability is not being preserved. And the third voting issue is the effectiveness of democracy promotion. So this is going to be a key voting issue in today's debate. As I've shown throughout my case, democracy promotion does not lead to democracy. That's not something that my opponent can just assume. That's not going to be, that's not necessarily a fact that will occur in the affirmative world. In his final speech, my opponent will attempt to tell you a story about how democracy is good and how democracy promotion will magically achieve all of these benefits. But that is all that it is. It's just a story. Because in the real world, when the United States tries to promote democracy in the Middle East, it won't achieve any of these benefits. It will only increase terrorism, increase instability, harming the lives of the millions of people in the Middle East and putting all of their lives and livelihoods at risk, which is clearly not a just way for the United States to pursue foreign policy and not a just manner of operating. So for these reasons, I continue to negate. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us at the High School Debate Championship at the City Club of Cleveland. That was Gigi Protasiewicz of Hathaway Brown High School. I'm Nick Castell from IdeaStream, here with Sebastian Williams, a sophomore at Gilmore Academy. The resolution being debated today is the U.S. ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. Now, we heard something in that last moment there. She was talking about voting issues to the judges. What exactly are voting issues?
So the way a voting issue, I guess, is kind of framed in debate is based off of what it means to, like, vote for somebody. At the end of the round, when the judge signs the ballot saying they voted for this debater, what a voting issue is supposed to do is basically try and give a really clear reason to the judge as to why you should be voting for the side who's giving the voting issues. So what Gigi did in her last speech was basically kind of summarize the major points and explain why specifically, under the value criterion of the round, why they should ultimately be voting neg. And now we're going to see Omer's own version of these voting issues.
And now we return to the debate.
Okay, really quickly, for the judges, I'm just going to boil down the round. So if the judges are ready, Gigi, let's begin. Okay, so we've already established in today's debate that there is a need for the U.S. to protect the liberty not only of its own citizens, but the liberty of the citizens of the Middle East as well. In fact, it would be hypocritical not to do so. We come home and we say that liberty is a universal due of each and every citizen, yet we don't go out universally and promote liberty. So once again, liberty is a due here. It's the most fundamental due. It's something that's intrinsic to us, intrinsic to each and every individual, and thus we must take stances to promote and to protect people's liberty. Once again, global stability is good, and we should advocate for global stability. But first and foremost, we look to liberty, not just because global stability is a prerequisite, but we have to remember that we're looking specifically to dues of each and every individual, and at the most fundamental level, we are due liberty. So the second point that I really want to emphasize is this idea of feasibility. So we know that democracy is compatible with the Middle East, and we know that it can be promoted successfully. Once again, I've discussed Turkey, I've discussed Tunisia, I've discussed Egypt, I've discussed Jordan, all of which the U.S. has used a variety of tools to handle the situation. Once again, the affirmative position can't be tied to just U.S. military intervention, which is Gigi's only example that she provides. Rather, there are so many other ways to promote democracy. There's humanitarian aid, such as education. You have substantive democracy, procedural democracy. There are so many ways, so many means that we can exercise to promote democracy. So making the blanket response that no type of intervention works whatsoever is counterintuitive and doesn't actually help us reach some type of solution. Once again, look back to the 4 examples I give you, 2 of which tell you that that democracy is compatible with the Middle East, and the other 2 showing that the U.S. promotion does actually bring about democratic institutions, and once again, these really go unresponded to. So the third point that I really want to emphasize is that there is a need to act. First and foremost, for security. That democracy results in less terrorism. I give you 3 reasons for that. That autocracies endorse and create terrorism. That democracies solve the problem. And 3, that intervening, especially to promote democracy, improves the image towards the Middle East and to the Muslim world. Furthermore, it's our best way to signal our rejections of the atrocities that we know are taking place in the Middle East, and we have to avoid culpability of the situation by promoting democracy. Furthermore, we have to understand that democracy is conducive to the protection of rights. It's a long-time solution. Once again, look back to what I say in my constructive. I show that democracy, the foundation of democracy, protects rights. And it's more than just implementation here. It's more than just solvency. Gigi can't just come up here and say, well, we can't look to the moral obligation because it won't work out. I've already refuted that it can and that it will work out because there's so many ways to promote democracy, but also not only is it the right thing to do, but it's in our best interest for both parties, the citizens of the Middle East and the citizens of the US. So once again, for these reasons, we have no reason not to affirm. Thank you.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Our judges are tallying right now. And while they do, can we get I was in the back a second ago thinking about how last week from this stage we had the Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations standing right here at this podium. And today we had Gigi Protasiewicz and Omer Ashruf debating kind of what the U.S.'s involvement really ought to be, and debating with every bit as robustly and with as every bit the vigor that they do in the United Nations. And I thank you both very much. It was a really incredible performance by both of you. Can we give them, please, a round of applause? So I may vamp a little bit up here for a moment, and I should say for the benefit of the listening audience, I'm Dan Malthrop, the Chief Executive here at the City Club. But let me ask you both a question. I want to ask you to both step up here as this is a really nerve-wracking moment for you, and I'm going to make it even worse. So stand up here for a second. I'm going to step off to the side, both of you. I just have a couple of questions for you. We would typically, if we had more time, we would go into a Q&A with the audience, but our time is somewhat short. And Gigi, I want to start with you. You had to argue the negative in this, and I wonder how you feel actually individually about this issue. If you could have chosen, or not which side is easier to argue, but which side do you believe in? Step up to the mic so we can.
Yeah. So I would have to say that personally, I would probably agree more with the affirmative because there just are so many possible implementations. But I try my best to argue for the negative.
Is it hard to do that?
Well, as a debater, you have to argue for both. So I wasn't very upset that I had to argue the negative today.
Mm-hmm. And Omer, what about you? How do you feel about the issue?
Right, I actually agree with Gigi. I would stand with the affirmative, not only because there are so many forms of implementation that it's hard to narrow it down to just one, but because of all the positive benefits, all the positive effects of promoting democracy. And I think it really is just a worthwhile means, a worthwhile way to solve the current atrocities in the Middle East.
Can you give the audience here in the room and also the listening audience, Gigi, a little bit of a sense of what was going through your mind from the moment in the back room where you realized that you'd be arguing the negative until you actually came up to the lectern?
Well, so obviously once I realized I was arguing the negative, I just had to start getting more in that mindset, think about what sort of arguments I needed to say, focus in on my own arguments, and just come into the debate with the mindset that I needed to be able to clarify the debate in my speech so that all the judges and all of you could still remember what I said even after hearing Omer's very nice final rebuttal.
Did he do okay?
Yes.
Omer, I have a question for you, unrelated to what we've just done, but you've both, I imagine, been watching the presidential debates, yes. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or critiques.
Any side in specific?
Well, I mean, are they good debaters?
Oh boy. So we'll see that a lot of one side more than another. We'll debate more about policies. We'll debate more about what is best for the American people. And I feel like one side in specific, or one side particularly, debates more about the size of your hands, or also different, I guess, ad hominem attacks. So really, sometimes when I watch this debate, I think that it's kind of counterproductive, that it isn't really helping us progress to a better America. Mm-hmm. But again, I think both of them both candidates from both sides, both Democratic and Republican, are both very great speakers. Mm-hmm. All of the candidates.
Gigi, I'm sure you've been watching them as well. Do do you think there's any one candidate from the very beginning when we had like 17 on the Republican side, anyone who you think is like probably the best just at the pure skill of debating?
I would say that that's really hard for me to judge for myself. I wouldn't be able to pick out a clear favorite among the Republican candidates.
Or the
as well.
Democrats, like just across the board, either either side?
I wouldn't say that like any one of them is probably just a great, like a much higher level speaker than the others. I would have to say that it probably would come down to their policies.
Okay. I think in a moment here, are we? I'm looking over here. Are we almost ready? We're nearly ready. We're nearly ready. So anyway, here we are. Omer, what do you think? You indicated before you actually started, when you were thanking, I think, 8,000 people who have all participated in helping you get to this point. But it sounded as if this transition into debating was something relatively new for you. How has this been for you, and how have you gotten so far so quickly?
Right. So actually, my freshman year, I started off doing public forum debate, and then both my coaches thought it'd be the best idea for me to move on to like Douglas debate, and I couldn't agree more with that. I think the idea of debating about ethics and moral obligation is really something that suits me and Gigi, and I think the way to do well in this event is really examining not only philosophy or like the philosophical question that the resolution proposes, but also looking to whether or not the United States has a moral obligation to affirm or negate.
Great. Omer, thank you very much. Gigi, thank you very much. And now we welcome back to the podium Tom Lucchese of Baker Hostetler to award the prizes in this great championship.
Well, once again, I'd like to give a big hand to both of our debaters for a phenomenal job. And the winner of today's debate is Gigi from Hathaway Brown. And does this conclude everything?
This concludes everything.
Well, this concludes the 2016 High School Championship debates here at the City Club. Thank you for coming. Oh, my favorite part.
Gigi, congratulations. That's excellent.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.